everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I hope everybody got to get out and see the eclipse today. It was a great day. It was so much fun. But my name is Jessica. I am a certified interpretive guide and certified environmental educator here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm generally a lover of the lesser loved and weird things about nature. So thank you again for joining me. This is the birds and the bees and the butterflies too, the science behind flowers getting frisky. So let's go ahead and get this shared. All right, I hope everybody can see that. We're good. All right. All right, so let's talk plant sex tonight. For a living thing that does not have a brain, plants continue to defy and challenge our knowledge of them constantly. But over 450 million years of evolution will do some wild things. For plants to be as successful as they have been over the course of their evolutionary history, they cannot just simply survive, but they must thrive. They must sow their wild oats, literally. And so their reproductive abilities have evolved in some pretty weird methods in order to continue to be so successful. But as I said, I like weird, and I hope you do too. Fair warning, there's a lot of innuendos in this presentation, but we're going to have a lot of fun with it. So for the sake of this presentation, we're going to be very specifically talking about angiosperm or flowering plant reproduction. The very word angiosperm is derived from the Greek words angion, which means vessel, and sperma, which means seed. Angiosperms are plants that produce flowers and bear their seeds in fruits. Today, there are more than 300,000 known species of flowering plants that make up 80% of all living green plants. World domination, right? So how did they get there in the first place? Let's take a step back to where it all started and how plants began evolving these reproductive systems in the first place. So this is a very, very simplified timeline of flowering of plants in general, which started as water-dwelling algae. It would take another 340 million years after the appearance of the first terrestrial plants for the first flowering plants to evolve. So mosses were the first terrestrial plants. They are non-vascular, meaning they don't have an internal system that brings water up from roots, which they also don't have. Instead, they must retain water like a sponge. From mosses came the vascular lycophytes, which have a similar reproductive system as mosses, but they have that vascular system with shallow roots. Ferns evolved out of that vascular system, but with a more simplified reproductive system using wind as opposed to water. From there, plants began to develop seeds, such as the early seed fern, which gave rise to the cone-producing plants, the gymnosperms, and flowering plants or angiosperms are derived from the gymnosperms. The first flowering plants are known to exist from approximately 160 million years ago. Arthropods have been around for much longer, around 450 million years, emerging during the Cambrian explosion of multicellular life. It was during this time that there is growing evidence that the earliest plants may have begun evolving relationships with these early arthropods to assist in the transfer of their sex cells, their sperms to their eggs. Current research studies suggest that mosses, which actually have a swimming sperm, much like humans, and even marine red algae, while mostly using water for this transfer, are possibly being assisted by microarthropods such as mites or isopods. Was this the case for those early plants? Only time in the fossil record will tell, but that's a whole nother presentation. Let's just stick with the flowering plants today. So we're going to zoom in now and take a closer look at something very interesting that happens right about here. Dinosaurs were not the only ones that had their golden age during the Cretaceous period. Flowering plants did too. In the Cretaceous period, there is a worldwide shakeup that happens during a 35 million year long span of time between 125 to 90 million years ago, and this is called the Aptian-Albian gap. This period is really well documented in the fossil record, and it basically what happens, gymnosperm diversity starts to go down, and flowering plants soon come to dominate the earth. Interestingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, arthropods also saw a shakeup during this time. So those that depended on gymnosperms or fed from gymnosperms using specialized mouth parts or specialized feeding behaviors, rendering them unable to make the transition to angiosperms, saw a mass extinction, really severely reducing in their diversity as well. However, those that did not have specialized mouth parts or feeding behaviors were more easily able to make that transition, did not suffer as severely, giving rise to greater pollinator diversity. So we can experience the after effects of this event still to this day with two well-known early pollinators. Scorpion flies were abundant gymnosperm feeders just as the first angiosperms were emerging. However, the vast majority of them became extinct during the Aptian-Albian gap, severely dropping their diversity. At some point, those that did survive that turnover period evolved from a long proboscis nectar feeding to a short proboscis for blood feeding, of which they remain today with only about 600 species. Beetles, on the other hand, do not have those specialized pollen or nectar feeding mouth parts or behaviors, which gave them the ability to make that early transition. And as a result, they presently make up the largest taxa group at over 400,000 known species and remain prolific pollinators of both flowering and non-flowering plants alike today. Pretty cool. So let's take a look at some terminology surrounding angiosperm reproductive parts and types. So we've got two different pollination processes. We've got cross-pollination, in which flowers pollinate across multiple plants, and self-pollination, in which the flower simply pollinates itself. Either type can be accomplished with the use of a living pollinator, such as bees and butterflies, or non-living pollinators, such as wind and water. Some basic terms for the various reproductive parts that we'll be discussing today. When we say male parts, we're talking about the stamen, which is made up of the anther and contains the pollen, and the filament, which holds the pollen, the anther up. When we say female parts, we're talking about the pistil, which consists of the stigma, and that is the opening at the top of the tubular style, which leads to the internal ovary, containing the egg cells to be pollinated, which go on to produce fruit and seeds. And there are three major reproductive systems within angiosperms: monachonous, monoecious, and dioecious. And each of those terms tells you in Greek exactly how that plant operates. So monachonous is Greek for one bed, meaning the flower carries both the stamen and the carpel together in one structure. These are bisexual or hermaphrodite flowers. Monachonous flowers are the most common type, and they make up the majority of those large, beautiful, showy flowers like the ones we give our loved ones on Valentine's Day. Monoecious translates to one household. These are separate male flowers called staminate flowers and female flowers called pistillate flowers, but they coexist together on the same plant. These plants are less common, but they can be either cross-pollinated or self-pollinated. Corn is a well-known example of a monoecious self-pollinating plant. The tassels at the top are the male part of the plant containing the pollen, and they sprinkle that pollen down onto the ears, which are the female part of the plant. Each kernel is its own flower and has to develop separately into the kernels that we eat today. Pretty neat. Other examples include watermelon, pumpkin, and hazelnut. And then there is dioecious, or two households. These species have completely separate male and female plants. Gynodioecious refers to female plants, while androdioecious refers to the male plant. These rely on cross-pollination. Dioecious plants are also less common, but include ginkgo, yew, spinach, and asparagus. It's also important to know that some angiosperms can transition. There is a difference between gender and functional gender among flowering plants. Just because a genodioecious plant, for example, has female reproductive parts, does not mean it's necessarily able to be pollinated at that time. Dioecious plants in particular can go through periods of sexual dormancy or asexuality or change genders entirely in response to environmental conditions, age, or is just part of its multi-year life cycle. Transgender angiosperms are highly understudied, but they're really fascinating. For example, the Chicago Botanical Garden boasts a variety of Japanese cobra lily that changes its gender from year to year, and that's that first photo up there on the top. Young cobra lilies produce male flowers with pollen until they are mature enough to produce a female flower that will hopefully go on to be pollinated and create the fruit. However, after an exhausting round of fruit making, the plant may take a break and produce male flowers the next year. Producing pollen rather than fruit saves energy. So basically, Japanese cobra lilies change sex from time to time to save energy and allow themselves time to recover. Some trees are pretty well known for doing this as well, such as the striped maples, red maples, black gum, honey locust, ginkgos, ash, and yews. Yew trees, like the cobra lily, tend to change from female to male due to stress, but in striped maples, multiple studies are trying to figure out what would cause a male tree to change to female because those trees are so well known for being prone to stress. One such study found that 75% of dead struck maples in their sample had produced female flowers the year before they died. Now, correlation does not equal causation, but I'm pretty sure every female identifying person on this call is internalizing that right now. So let's all try to take better care of ourselves. It's okay, plants stress out too. So we know a little bit about the history of angiosperms as well as some anatomy and reproductive processes. Now let's take a look at some specific examples. Angiosperms love their pollinators so much that they are some of the most extraordinary examples of coevolution in which plants have developed a complete codependency on their pollinators or vice versa. Essentially, pollinators are the third wheels of plant sex, and they've gotten so creative. So we'll see some examples from around the world, as well as some notable examples from right here in North Carolina. And we're going to start with the OG of pollinators, the beetles. And not those beetles, sorry about that. Although, did you know that there is such thing as the McCartney rose, named after Paul McCartney? Go ahead and Google it if you want. They're really pretty. Anyways, the beetles, the original pollinators. We touched base a little bit about beetles being the Cretaceous survivors of what feels like the 35 million year long Hunger Games. But these guys are so epic. They've been evolving for roughly 350 million years. This beetle here in the first photo, along with three other extinct beetle species dating back 99 million years ago, encased in amber, were the subject of a recent study in 2017. The beetles were found to be carrying pollen of flowering and non-flowering plants alike. And while the pollen from the non-flowering plants corresponded to different species of cycads that were known to exist at the time, the pollen from the flowering plant belonged to a newly described species of water lily, and that's the only reason we know this plant existed, was from the pollen from these beetles. This represents a clear link of how pollination from flowering plants may have evolved from arthropods that were visiting non-flowering plants. This evidence predates even the oldest pollen-covered bee fossil by 30 million years, making beetles the oldest known pollinators of flowering plants. They are the experienced, mature lovers of the pollinator world. So there are several characteristics that are common among beetle pollinated plants. So this includes large cup-like flowers, heavily scented blossoms, leathery or tough petals and leaves. And although beetles do have color vision, they primarily rely on their sense of smell. So here in North Carolina, fine little notable magnolias are one of the oldest flowering plants. Beetles are one of the earliest flowering pollinators, is a match for the ages, quite literally. The oldest known magnolia fossil dates around 95 million years ago, with modern magnolias popping into the fossil record about 20 million years ago. And beetles have been their primary pollinators ever since. So this definitely gives me a little more appreciation for those beautiful southern magnolias that we see so frequently here in the South. So next time you see them blooming, check them out, see if you can find some of those beetles. Flies are the underrated lovers of the pollinator world that are not talked about much. They're pesky, they carry bacteria, and we tend to think they're super gross because they have a fetish. They're attracted to those putrid smells like rotting meat, but they are a really surprisingly effective pollinator. Sweet nectar will attract them as well, and unlike bees or butterflies or other more popular pollinators, they're not subject to those narrow windows of daytime or certain weather conditions. In a current study, flies are being experimented with in Australia in an attempt to diversify pollinators and increase crop yields. They do this by, I kid you not, setting out rotting meat all throughout the field in order to attract them. And in some of these experiments, crop yields nearly doubled with the use of the flies. And this work will be really important to understand the pollination potential of other insect species in the future. Woo, corpse plants. Corpse plants are some of the more fascinating and infamous angiosperms to utilize flies and other carrion insects such as beetles as pollinators. These massive plants not only absolutely reek, but they have set some pretty impressive records. So that top photo there is actually one that I took at our own local Juniper Botanic Garden last summer when the specimen bloomed. I got a good whiff of it. It stank to high heaven. It was amazing. It was such a cool experience. It's a pretty big deal when one blooms. They tend to be a pretty big tourist attraction when that happens because they can go 4 to 10 years or more between flowerings, blooming for only 24 to 36 hours. It's more commonly known as Titan arum, but its Latin name is a little spicier than that. It's Amorphophallus titanium, which roughly translates to giant misshapen penis for very obvious reasons. The term Titan arum was actually coined by Sir David Attenborough himself during the making of Private Life of Plants, because the original name was considered to be too rude for the British BBC audience. Native to the rainforest of Sumatra, this plant can grow to be up to 10 feet tall, but it is not the world's largest flower, but the world's largest unbranched inflorescence. At the base of this structure, if you were able to climb up on this ladder here and peer down into the leaves, down here at the base inside, clustered around the column is an array of tiny little flowers, both male and female flowers. So this is a monoecious plant, separate flowers, same plant, that all must be pollinated. In enclosed botanical settings that lack proper pollinators, the staff will go in there and cut a window in the base of the structure, and the garden staff will go in there with a tiny little paintbrush and hand pollinate them. And then the record for the largest flower in the world is held by a different corpse plant called Rafflesia, which is that massive red flower in the other picture there. This is a parasitic plant from Southeast Asia that invades vines and grows enormous flowers over 3 feet in diameter and weighing over 20 pounds. This flower seems like something straight out of science fiction, and it has an equally weird story to match its appearance. Quite frankly, this flower should not exist. It is crazy how this flower just absolutely should not exist. First, its seeds are really difficult to germinate. Then, it has gambled its entire life on entirely parasitizing just one species of vine. So the flower has to germinate right next to that single species of vine in order to be successful at parasitizing it. If they survive that, after a few years of parasitism, the plant eventually may produce a single flower bud. But most of those flower buds die before they open. If they do survive to bloom, like Titan, it must fight a tight window for survival. The flower only lasts a day or two, and it has to attract pollinators quickly to cross-pollinate with a nearby flower of the opposite sex. The trouble is, the male and female flowers are now so rare that it's a miracle to even find a couple blooming at the same time and ready to cross-pollinate each other. So this flower shouldn't exist, and quite frankly, probably won't exist in the very, very near future. Now, if stinking smelling plants sounds familiar to any of you here in North Carolina, it's because we have our own version of it, the infamous Bradford pear. Not nearly as impressive, but just as stinky. This is an invasive tree, and it's pretty well known for smelling rotten. Some equate it to fish, others to rotting meat, while the Urban Dictionary affectionately calls it the semen tree. And I'll let you do what you want with that information. But regardless of the specifics, it does smell, making flies one of its biggest biological pollinators, although it does pollinate by wind as well. And of course, we have a notable that quite literally has fly in the name. Venus flytraps and other carnivorous plants have evolved a delicate balance to prevent making a tasty meal out of its pollinators. Flytraps and some pitcher plants will grow flowers tall enough to keep their pollinators away from harm. You can see the tiny little flytrap in that picture and the super tall white flowers. Other carnivorous plants will grow their flowers first and their traps later. Hoverflies and bees are a major source of pollinators for these amazing native plants that we have here in North Carolina. Wasps are the horny ones who are just here to have a good time, but plants can get them to do some wonky things. Wasps, like bees, have very high energy needs, and so while they're mostly insectivorous, they do utilize nectar as well. Because of those needs, wasps rely heavily on their sense of smell. Over 100 orchid species are exclusively dependent on a single species of wasp to carry out pollination, and do so by taking advantage of that sense of smell. For example, that first photo there, that black wasp with that purple flower there, that is called a hammer orchid, and it's just one of many orchid species that employs sophisticated sexual trickery, mimicking the appearance and the pheromone smell of the female wasp, in this case, the thinid wasp. So males will attempt to mate with the flower, exchanging pollen in the process. And yes, scientists have found male wasp sperm on the flower too. So they both get something out of it. Win-win, am I right? There's also a species of orchid that does this with bees, aptly named bee orchid. Some flower species have even gone so far as to develop the ability to release certain scents that attract wasps when the plants are being eaten by caterpillars. This alerts wasps to the presence of caterpillars to feed on, which they do, and inadvertently defend the plant. Once again, a win-win situation. Okay, full disclosure. I am sorry if this ruins figs for you, but fig wasps have a fascinating life cycle that involves invasions, incest, and insectivorous plants. It's an example of obligate mutualism, as neither the fig nor their namesake wasp can exist without the other, a result of 60 million years of evolution. It all begins when a pollen-covered female wasp crawls inside a hole at the bottom of the immature fruit. She lays her eggs inside some of the flowers tucked inside, simultaneously pollinating the fig in the process. Then she dies. The flowers stuffed with eggs form gall-like ovaries in which the wasp's larvae develop, while the wasp-free flowers go on to become the seeds inside the mature fruit. Here's where it gets weird. The male wasps are wingless. They do not have wings, so the males are the first to hatch, where they will then fight each other for the rights to mate with their sisters who are still trapped inside their galls. The males then dig holes out of the fig, but they're wingless. They can't go anywhere. So the vast majority of them also die within the fig. The winged females then emerge already mated, escape that fig, via those escape tunnels. The males start. They pick up a coating of male fig pollen on their way out, and the life cycle continues on. Now, that leaves us with the issue of this fig fruit that is now full of dead male wasps at the body of their mother. The fig, as it as that fruit ripens, it releases an enzyme called ficin, and that breaks down their corpses and absorbs them into the fruit. So while there are not likely to be full insect body parts in your fig jam, they are dissolved in there. Hey, did you know spiders? Some spider species, particularly crab spiders and jumping spiders, make pretty effective pollinators. I mean, okay, they are just here for the food, right? They are ambush predators. They're just using these flowers as an all-you-can-eat buffet, not for the nectar like other pollinators, but for the insects that visit those flowers. So they spend their days lurking in and amongst the flowers, waiting for their next meal to wander into their path. And as these spiders roam from flower to flower, they inadvertently pick up and transfer pollen in the process. Scientists estimate that spiders devour as much as 800 million tons of prey every single year, making them a friend to gardeners and farmers alike. But there is a trade-off. While spiders do make excellent pest control, they also tend to be indiscriminate when it comes to their prey, driving off or even consuming bees, butterflies, wasps, and other important pollinators. However, recent research has shown that some plants have learned to coexist with this trade-off by adopting the enemy of my enemy is my friend strategy, releasing certain scents that attract the spiders when the plants are being attacked and consumed, just like we learned some plants do with wasps. In China, a pair of environmental scientists from Yunnan University were exploring a tropical rainforest in southwest China when they came across an interesting spider that seemed like it was attempting to mimic the Hoya flowers around it. Okay, mimicry, cool. Lots of examples of that in the animal kingdom, right? Especially among flowers and their pollinators, except upon closer inspection, they found that what they were seeing was actually two spiders, one on top of the other, cooperatively resembling a single flower. The pair were a male and a female. Do you see her? It took me forever to realize that she was in this picture. So you can see the male, super easy peasy. This is the female right here. I had to zoom in on it and figure out that she was actually in that photo. It took me forever to find her. The female takes on the appearance of the fused pale petals, while the male sits on the female's back and takes on the darker coloration to match the appearance of the pistil of the flower. The spiders are part of a crab family, a crab spider family, excuse me, which typically do live on or near flowers. And they're well known for their ability to blend into the flowers around them. But what makes these two so unique is the fact that this could be the first ever observation of what is called cooperative mimicry, which requires more than one participant working together to create a convincing camouflage. So more research is currently being done on these two to definitively prove cooperative mimicry and learn more about these spiders' evolutionary relationship with these flowers, including whether or not they are primary pollinators of this flower. Moths are the dependable, responsible ones. They take their roles very seriously, often pairing with a single type of plant. Unlike butterflies, which rely on a host plant, but the host plant does not necessarily rely on the butterfly, many plant species do rely solely on moths. Although not all moths are nocturnal, plants that have evolved to rely on moths for pollination tend to open late afternoon, early morning, or at night. They also tend to be white or light in color and very sweetly fragrant. Examples of some moth-pollinated plants include morning glory, tobacco, gardenia, and yucca. In fact, there are 49 species and 24 subspecies of yucca that are pollinated only by this moth right here, this white moth that is called a yucca moth. The most famous of which are the Joshua trees. Despite their name, they're not actually trees, but a species of yucca. However, there's an even cooler moth that I would love to share their story with you. So in 1862, Charles Darwin was sent a specimen of orchid that was discovered in the jungles of Madagascar. Darwin studied this orchid backwards and forwards and theorized that the flower could only be pollinated by some then unidentified insect with a very long proboscis, over 20 centimeters in length, which was insane to think about at the time. In fact, many of his colleagues and fellow scientists seemed to think so too, believing him to be wildly wrong, and went so far as to publicly ridicule him for his prediction. But Darwin stuck to it. He was a very serious student of orchids. He examined them, tested them, experimented on them all to help develop his theory of evolution. He even wrote a book on his experiments with orchids. Unfortunately, his prediction went unverified until 21 years after his death, when the moth was discovered and his theory was validated. The comet orchid, also called Darwin's orchid, is pollinated solely by a species of hawk moth, whose Latin name translates to predicted moth in honor of Charles Darwin. It has a whopping 16-centimeter wingspan and a 35-centimeter long proboscis. Not until 2021, a whole 139 years after Darwin's death, was it discovered that this moth is not a subspecies of hawk moth, but its own distinct species. So the story has come to be seen as one of the celebrated predictions of the theory of evolution. And while Darwin had the opportunity to study and theorize about the Madagascar comet orchid, another species of the same genus grows on the remote Reunion Island out in the Indian Ocean. So this orchid is highly similar, but with a shorter nectar tube. However, the length was still something challenging to the average pollinator, and with no hawk moths around, it left researchers scratching their head as to what could possibly pollinate this type of orchid. That is until 2008, when a grad student set up some cameras and found something completely unexpected, a cricket. And like Darwin's comet orchid and moth, the size of the cricket's head matched up with the size of the nectar spurt opening of this flower. This is a species of raspy cricket, and it holds the title of first and presently only verified pollinator of the member Orthoptera to be caught pollinating a plant. Although current studies have identified roughly 41 other species of this order that could potentially be classified as pollinators in the future, but that research is still ongoing. I mentioned earlier that it's possible that aquatic non-flowering plants such as red algae and mosses might possibly be using third-party sex relationships, but we have aquatic angiosperms that seem to be doing this as well. Seagrasses in the genus Thalassia are dioecious angiosperms. They actually evolved on land first before returning to the sea, bringing those insect-pollinated flowers with them. Nowadays, most seagrasses also reproduce by cloning, so their sexual reproduction has been mostly overlooked, assuming water pollination. That is until 2012, when researchers from Mexico decided to take a closer look and observed tiny, often microscopic sea creatures such as isopods and worms clustering on the seagrass flowers. Turns out these critters visit these underwater flowers specifically when the male gametes are fertile, usually early in the evening. The flowers open for just a short period of time, and those male flowers produce pollen in these sticky, mucousy strands. So these little sea critters, they feed on those, and in the process, those gametes get stuck to the invertebrate's body. Later on in the evening, the female plants become fertile and open up. So they move then to the female plants to continue feeding and inadvertently transfer gametes that way. So in that way, pollination occurs, and it appears that this formerly terrestrial angiosperm has successfully adapted to their aquatic environment and generated a whole previously unknown set of pollinators. So about 300 species of fruit depend on bats for pollination, such as mangoes, bananas, and guavas. To attract bats, these plants have evolved flowers with a musty smell, not unlike fermenting fruit, but bats are the ones who like to listen. So some plant species have even gone so far as to evolve flowers with acoustic features that allow the bat to easier find the flower via echolocation. So these flowers will often have a bell-shaped concave form, which effectively reflects the sounds the bat emits. And about 4 different species of bats have a mutualistic relationship with agave. Pregnant bats need the nectar from these plants to fuel their annual migratory journeys between central Mexico and the US. The agaves depend on the migratory bats to pick up pollen as they feed to disperse it. Agave is best known for making tequila and agave syrup, which is a good alternative sweetener. The plant can also be used to make rope, paper, fabric, soap, amongst other ethnobotanical uses. So go ahead, make yourself a margarita tonight. I won't judge, just give thanks to the bats. Aside from bats, there are also some non-flying mammal pollinators. These plants typically attract rodent pollinators by growing on or near the ground for access to specialized high sugar nectar, often between 30 and 60% sugar. So their smells range from highly sweet and fragrant to yeasty or musty. That center photo, though, there is Protea humiflora, also called the rodent sugar bush. It is native to the Rocky Mountainous areas of South Africa and attracts several mice species and a shrew species with nectar that has the consistency of syrup. It's very, very thick. The one on the left, Masonia depressa, is an African lily, also native to South Africa, that has an extremely thick, almost jelly-like nectar. They are pollinated by 4 different rodent species, including 2 gerbil species. However, not all plants that have developed relationships with non-flying mammals are low-growing and rodent-pollinated. The traveler's palm of Madagascar hosts the world's largest pollinator, the lemur, specifically the black and white ruffed lemurs. These trees grow 40 feet high and they have tough flower cases that have to be cracked open. Excuse me. So the lemurs use their nimble little hands to crack open those flower cases. They stick their faces in there for the nectar and pick up all that pollen and transfer from flower to flower. As a result, the fruits that are made from that are a major source of food in the Madagascar jungle. And it appears that no other creature has the strength and nimbleness to pollinate this palm, proving that size does, in fact, matter. Now, before we start with the protest, but Jessica, it's not the size of the boat that matters, it's the motion of the ocean. Okay, I gotcha. Here's this tiny, cute little guy called a honey possum. They're native to Australia. They're only a few inches in body size, not including their prehensile tail. They're about the size of a mouse and for all intents and purposes, look like a mouse. But they are marsupials related to, you guessed it, possums. They're mainly nocturnal, but they are responsible for pollinating a wide variety of flowers. They have a really high metabolic rate, so they need a year-round continuous supply of nectar to survive. It is a lot of responsibility for a tiny little thing, but it gets even more interesting. While male honey possums are smaller than the females, they have extremely large testes, up to 4.2% of their body weight, and the largest sperm of any mammal in the world. The motion of the ocean, indeed. So this is a relatively new discovery, just in 2017. So this plant, aptly named the hidden flower plant, is native to the high elevation rocky areas of South Africa again. Its flowers are produced at the base of the plant. So you can see the leaves in this picture, and the flowers are way down here, hidden behind the leaves of the flower. What they lack in visibility, though, they make up for in nectar and smell, with each flower producing copious amounts of very sticky, sugar-rich nectar. Now, low growing, high sugar content in the nectar, both of these together sound like a rodent pollinator, right? But after watching hours and hours of video footage, a team of researchers in South Africa have been able to demonstrate that lizards, not mammals, not birds, not insects, but lizards were the main pollinators of this plant. So two species of lizard native to the area, the Cape Mountain lizard and the common crag lizard, were the main visitors to this plant over the duration of the study period. So we already know that there are many lizard species that have sugary solutions or flowers in their diet, such as geckos in particular. But this is what makes the study of pollinators so tricky. Just because something visits a flower does not necessarily mean that they're pollinating it. Scientists have to actively demonstrate successful transfer of pollen. So there are presently additional studies being done on lizards as pollinators. Meat is Zexon's Brazilian tree frog. While most frogs eat a diet rich in insects, this species in Brazil has a rather unconventional dietary behavior. They dive headfirst into the Brazilian milk fruit tree flowers for its nectar. A team of researchers in Brazil just last year in 2023 observed that when the frog comes out, pollen grains were stuck to its body as it hopped from flower to flower in the forest. So scientists believe that this could be the first time an amphibian has been observed pollinating plants. However, again, they do caution that more research needs to be done. And of course, we can't end this presentation without the birds, the bees, and the butterflies too. Hummingbirds are especially well-known avian pollinators and some of the most visually compelling examples of coevolution. With those beaks made for probing, there's a size and shape for everyone, honey. They also hold some pretty impressive records. As a group, amongst their ranks is the smallest bird in the world and the farthest migration, at least when body size is accounted for. The hummingbird family has the second highest number of species in any bird family, about 340 known species. They also have the highest metabolism, with hearts that pump 1,200 times a minute and wings that beat 70 times a second. To survive, they must eat several times their body weight in nectar every day. Plants with flowers evolved to attract birds are called ornithophilous. Raise your hand if you're an ornithophile. Woo woo! As hummingbirds evolved to become better at probing flowers for nectar and inadvertently becoming efficient pollinators, their partnered plants found ways of becoming more attractive to the hummingbirds. And although some species like the sword-billed hummingbird there pollinate only one or a few plant species, most hummingbirds forage from a wide variety of plant species. It is entirely likely that the rich diversity of plants in Central and South America, which has some of the highest diversity on the planet, is tied to the diversity of hummingbirds and their pollination. Yet this is still an ongoing process. This is not just something that happened a long time ago that we're seeing now. Hummingbirds continue to co-evolve with plants and become ever more flamboyant through sexual selection, with more species being discovered every year. Bees arguably play the largest role in reproduction than any pollinator. They are the dependable ones. More than 4,000 bee species buzz around the United States. According to the USDA, honeybees alone pollinate 80% of all flowering plants, including more than 130 types of fruits and vegetables growing in the United States, accounting for more than $15 billion a year in crops. Additional fun fact. When male honeybees mate, upon transfer of semen to the female, their penises actually explode so forcefully it tears open their abdomens. So male honeybees actually die from ejaculation. Men, I'm so sorry about that. um, Blueberry bushes, native blueberry bushes here in North Carolina. They're technically self-pollinating, but they're also cross-pollinated by several species of bees. These plants are a little more picky about their cross-pollination. The male parts of the flower need a little stimulation, so to speak. Quite bluntly, they need vibrators, like literally need vibrators. So the pollen is inside the anther. It's not dusted on the outside like most flowers have. So enter the vibrating bees. Bees are capable of something called buzz pollination. And this is the ability of a bee to beat its wings so rapidly it generates a low frequency buzz, which causes pollen to ejaculate out the small pore at the tip of the flower's anther. As they gather the pollen and move from flower to flower, those movements deposit some of that pollen on the female parts of the flower, resulting in cross-pollination and a higher fruit yield on these blueberries. So not all bees, however, play by those rules. So eastern carpenter bees, they're too big to get the sweet nectar from inside the base of the blueberry flowers by going in the normal way. So they come in through the back door, so to speak. Carpenter bees will actually tear a slit in the base of the flower, like the one in the little circle photo there. You can see the little slit in the side of that flower, and rob the nectar from straight from the base, but that's without pollinating it. This strategy can cause other bees to unfortunately come in and start using that slit as well, which reduces pollination efficiency and fruit production. Like hummingbirds, butterflies are famous for their evolutionary relationships with plants. Most butterflies rely on a host plant to lay their eggs and for their caterpillars to eat. But what people tend to forget is that it's not necessarily a mutual coevolutionary relationship, as the plants themselves oftentimes don't rely on the butterflies strictly for pollination. Just the opposite, actually. There's a reason some people tend to not like having caterpillars on their plants. They will voraciously eat and strip those plants of their foliage. Because of this, most butterfly host plants try to evolve ways to keep them away by developing toxins in their leaves. But the caterpillars find a way around that and now store those same toxins in its body as a way to prevent from being eaten themselves, hence the bright colors. Some butterflies so the butterflies are like the possessive exes of the pollinator world. Just let me love you. This butterfly here is called the Atala hair streak, and it's particularly interesting due to its ancient co-evolutionary relationship, not with an angiosperm like most, but with a gymnosperm, a living fossil called a cootie. Cooties contain a potent liver toxin called psychocin, which the Atalas absorb into their body and display that danger warning in those bright orange colors they have there. I had the pleasure of working with and teaching people about this butterfly in Florida for many years. It's gorgeous. It's an amazing animal, but it was actually considered extinct. It was declared extinct in 1937. This once abundant butterfly was a victim of habitat loss as counties, uh, as colonizers were kind of taking over. They were using the coontie roots to make starch. So this led to the mass unsustainable harvest, decimating coontie populations and taking the butterfly with it. However, it was rediscovered on an island off the coast of Miami in 1959, and the butterfly has since made a significant recovery and is considered both a conservation success story and a stark reminder of the importance of conserving co-evolutionary relationships. We cannot save one without saving the other two. On that note, taking aside the silliness and the cool fun facts and the obscure trivia knowledge that you now possess, there is a purpose for understanding this relationship between plants and their pollinators. Millions of years, sometimes hundreds of millions of years, have created these really delicate balance, but all it could take is a few decades or less for it all to fall apart. So within those finely tuned partnerships, that delicate balance is to save a flower, but we must not only consider what is threatening that flower, we must also consider the threats to its pollinators and what needs to be done to protect them too. So while habitat loss remains the largest threat to plants and their pollinators, it is by no means the only large threat. For example, a recent study on moths suggests that air pollution may blunt or even block the signature scents of some night blooming flowers, jeopardizing their pollination. Exotic diseases, toxic chemicals are presenting a constant threat to commercial bee populations. It is also the unfortunate reality today in the United States that politics is playing a large role in preventing further protection of our natural resources. You can learn more about plant conservation in the United States by checking out the Center for Plants Conservation. It's just saveplants.org. They actually have a full pollinator database in there that they're constantly adding to if you want to check out the work that they're doing in partnership with the San Diego Zoo. So much like humans, plants have an incredible variety of expressions and relationships that are all just as important in their own ways. We hear more often about those beautiful, showy hermaphrodite flowers as being the most productive plants. And we hear more about the bees and the butterflies being the most effective pollinators. But plants that are transsexual or asexual are no less important to their ecosystems. And the pollinators, who may be the only ones of their entire taxonomic order, may mean the difference between survival and death to their partner plants. So hopefully this presentation made you think a little differently about plants as spring continues to roll on, and hopefully give you a good chuckle in the process. May you all have the opportunity to observe all these different flower types, those delicate balance with their pollinators. And for those of you here in North Carolina, friendly reminder, don't forget to take your allergy meds. That plant sperm this year has been the highest ever on record. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I really look forward to seeing if you have any questions or conversation.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was such a fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed it. Definitely, yeah, let's open the floor up for a Q&A. So if anyone has questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat and I can read them out loud. You're also welcome to unmute yourself, or I can also, you can use the hand raising feature as well for me to unmute you. Either way. I actually just start off. Can you say the what the name of that spider was again, but the co-mimicry?
It's a species of crab spider.
Okay.
I don't have the Latin name on me right now, but I can send you the link to the study that was done, because it was really interesting. I was like, whoa, it took me forever to find that female spider that was in there. Let me grab
Yeah, I feel like
this
the
link right
recording
here
now
for
just
ya.
has me like when I saw it.
Yeah, it's just really, really interesting.
It's so
It's fun
sweet.
learning new things like that. And we're just like, whoa, like it blows your mind.
Awesome.
And
Thank
in
you for
that article, it like explains it in layman's terms, but they do have the link to the actual scientific study paper, and it's.
Okay,
but yeah.
cool. Thank you. Any other
Dawn,
questions?
more protein in the pigs.
Yeah, that's back with the figs. Yeah, I'd always heard about the I mean that there are figs in them, but I never heard the word dissolved to describe it, and I feel like that made it worse. Yeah, let's see. Got Sarah raising. Let me unmute you. All right, I think you should be able to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, Jessica, Sarah down in Florida. I just want to say that was awesome. It's good to hear you do a presentation again. Really enjoyed it. I just wanted to let you know, also a comment about Atalas for the first time on record. Jonathan Dickinson State Park has Atala butterflies, and it's like the most northern part of their range. So we're super stoked. I can't buy Kunti fast enough.
That's so great to hear. We have so many of them when I was working at Green Cay. I mean, they were out in the parking lot like crazy, and it was so cool to see them. It's nice to hear that they're spreading.
Yeah, super exciting. They've definitely decimated some really ancient Kunti that have been probably by the building for about 20, 25 years. And the Atalas have finally found them. So I had to buy more Kunti to keep up.
Yay! That's so great to hear. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. It makes me happy.
My pleasure. And it was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Any more questions for Jessica? Another person typing.
The mosquitoes do pollinate, actually. Yes, because female, I believe it's only female mosquitoes that blood suck, that take your blood. Male mosquitoes drink nectar. As much as I hate them so much. I do not like mosquitoes at all, but yeah, they are pollinators.
I have more fun question. What's your favorite, like maybe not specific species, but just like overall like type of pollinator, like out of all the ones you mentioned?
That's a really good question. Honestly, I love the concept of the like little mammals. I love the concept of like little mammals. Like these plants have literally evolved to grow on the ground with this thick, sticky nectar, just specifically so mammals can lick it. It's just like I love it. It's so cool, and they develop that so that the insects can't steal it. So like butterflies, for example, have that straw sucking proboscis. Like they can't suck up syrup, or that thick jelly nectar. So they evolved that specifically for the mammals. I think that's just fascinating. It's so cool. The name for the gap, and it's the Aptian Albion. Aptian Albion gap during the Cretaceous period.
Okay. Final questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well,
It's getting late, so I
yeah,
really
thank you so much.
everybody joining me today. And like I said, I hope you got to get outside and see the eclipse and get out there in the springtime and go observe some pollinators.
Wonderful. It's all right. Thank you so